In this video, I'm going to attack for 257 damage on turn 3 in Legacy. But before we can watch this, we gotta learn how this deck works. Creative Technique is a broken magic card that you might not have seen before. For 5 mana we can shuffle our library and then flip the top card until we hit a spell, then we can cast it for free. This is an average effect in Legacy until you learn what Demonstrate does. For free, we can copy this spell by giving our opponent their own copy of Creative Technique, giving us 2 copies of the card. So to build around this card, our deck is full of lands that tap for 2 mana, so as soon as turn 3 we can cast a Cascade creature which will cascade into Creative Technique, which will let us cast more Cascade creatures and hopefully go through a lot of our deck to swing with a lot of creatures to win the game. Now we are playing Legacy here, so there's a ton of interaction we're going to have to battle, so let's see how this deck actually plays out. To start the first round of this video, we have a good opening hand because we have lands plus Cascade creatures. Now if you thought scamming a Grief was a problem in Modern, well it's also a thing in Legacy, and that's because Reanimate exists. So here the opponent casts a turn 1 Grief, and while they don't have a Reanimate, I expect it coming down on a few turns later. This is good for us though, because Grief plus Reanimate is not great against this deck, because we can just draw another Cascade creature off the top like we do here. I also want to highlight that while this deck may be brain dead, there is still one important decision to make every single turn, and that's what land should we play. So here in our hand, our only Cascade cards are both red, meaning that against the Wasteland deck, we want to protect our red lands and play them as late as possible, so that we can protect our red sources to actually make our spells castable. So while my opponent just swamp cycles and casts a Ponder, if they did have a Wasteland, them getting rid of one of our red sources would be a big deal, which is why I led with the green one. After we pass the turn, it's clear the opponent found a Reanimate from that Ponder because they get that Grief back from the graveyard, taking our boarding party and making our life a bit more awkward. To slow us down even more, they do have that Wasteland, which is quite annoying here. Now the problem for the opponent is a 3-2 with Menace is not a lot of pressure, we're not taking any damage from our mana base, so here we just have all the time in the world to make our land drops and pass back the turn. As long as the opponent does not find multiple Wastelands, we should just make it to 7 mana so that we can cast this Wanderer. Now we have an interesting card off the top, and that's a Creative Technique. While I do have access to up to 6 mana this turn, I think it's a mistake to cast it, and that's because to put it on the stack, I would have to sacrifice at least one of my lands. But don't forget, my opponent is going to have interactive cards like Daze, Force of Will, or even Force of Negation, and I think it's way better to wait one more turn so I do not have to sacrifice my lands to cast it, so if they do have some counterspells, I won't be bothered. Then the opponent follows up with another Grief, but that's not very good here because we have 3 very strong cards in our hand, and then they follow up with the Murktide Regent tapping out and only having 1 card left in their hand. So now I think it's a lot smarter to go for the Wanderer because not only do we get double Cascade, but if they have a Daze, then they're only going to be able to counter 1 spell. It's just good to put the pressure on here because if we let them untap with that Murktide Regent, they can start hitting us for some serious damage. So now when we get a boarding party out of our deck and cascade into a Creative Technique, the Demonstrate actually screws us over a bit, and that's because the opponent flips a Force of Will from their own Creative Technique, so the Demonstrate counters itself here. But that doesn't matter, because now we get to cascade into another creature and just keep going through all of the Creative Techniques in our deck. Going into sideboarding, I add in 4 Gemstone Caverns just for some clunky lands so that we can speed up our deck. However, while Game 2 starts off nicely with the Gemstone Caverns, I actually made a huge mistake during sideboarding. And this is because after I eventually put a boarding party on the stack and get a Creative Technique and demonstrate that Creative Technique, the opponent gets a Reanimate, gets back a Grief, and after I resolve one of my Creative Techniques, getting an Aurora Phoenix, they Surgical Extraction the Creative Technique, removing any Cascade targets from the deck. I think this should have been expected during sideboarding, so I should have had the Ooze in my deck. After Surgical Extracting all of my Creative Techniques out of my deck, the opponent has no cards in hand, so as the game developed, I managed to find another Cascade card which returned the Aurora Phoenixes from my graveyard to my hand, but not having any Cascade targets was a huge deal, and the opponent managed to get a Murktide Regent down, which eventually beat me to death. Okay, going into Game 3, I'm not going to make the same mistake, so let's get the Ooze in our list and ship it back. Our game 3 opening hand is great because we just want to hit all of our land drops. As we know the opponent is playing a ton of discard spells, griefs, and counter spells, we shouldn't worry too much about the cards in our hand and more about the lands. So when the opponent starts off with a turn 1 Ponder, I'm feeling great because we care more about the opponent having wastelands than having spells. Now things don't feel too great when the opponent has a turn 2 Wasteland and a turn 3 Wasteland, as well as getting back their troll from their graveyard with a Reanimate. Now if you thought 2 Wastelands wasn't great, well how about attacking for 6 and playing a 3rd Wasteland? Now we're still not in any trouble because the opponent plays their 2nd mana source and a Murktide Regent, and now with 6 mana we can just slam our Aurora Phoenix and hope the opponent doesn't have a counterspell. Against these blue decks, casting Creative Technique with Demonstrate is always scary because they can hit a counterspell, like they do here, a Blue Elemental Blast. So now if my opponent has any counter or Surgical Extraction in their hand, well they'll win the game. But don't forget, we still have the Oozes in our deck, so the Surgical Extraction wouldn't have been that amazing here, but they didn't have one anyways. So we get to put another Creative Technique on the stack, which finds another Force of Will for the opponent, so we're just going to rely on this one Creative Technique to get there, which does find us the Wanderer, so now we can cascade twice, find another Creative Technique, and we're just going to go through our whole deck. Finding an Emrakul the Aeon's Torn always feels great, but why don't we watch a matchup where things can be difficult not because the opponent will have counterspell interaction, but creature and land interaction. Things start off normally with the opponent playing a Plains and a turn 2 Thalia. Now it's important to note that Creative Technique's Demonstrate ability does not need to be paid for Thalia attacks, and that's because we copy it and not cast the copy with Demonstrate. That's relevant. But if we cascade into Creative Technique, we will have to pay the extra 1 mana to put it on the stack if it's from a Cascade creature. So it's 6 mana to cast from our hand, 1 extra mana to cast from a Cascade creature, and Demonstrate does not have any additional cost. So we're going to speed up these next few turns because the opponent did not have enough pressure for me to go for the Creative Technique in my hand, so I was trying to get enough mana so that I could cast multiple Creative Techniques from my deck by paying Thalia attacks. So with the City of Traders off the top, we now have 8 mana in play. That's going to be 6 mana to cast the Creative Technique from our hand, and then we can pay 1 additional mana for any Creative Techniques we flip into. And this is a matchup where Demonstrate doesn't matter. The opponent cascades into a Flicker Wisp, which flickers their Recruiter of the Guard. Now we Creative Technique, but that actually finds a Creative Technique of its own, which is pretty terrible, but we get to Demonstrate again, so there's 3 copies on the stack and we don't mind. The opponent finds a useless Chrome Mox, so they're not going to be doing anything with that. But then our Creative Technique hits another Creative Technique. So we've essentially wasted 2 premium spots here, because if we had any creatures to put pressure on the board, then we actually would have done something. Creative Technique is good because you're meant to get a Cascade creature to go along with the Creative Technique. But here I've just paid 2 mana to get another Creative Technique. So now we've just got to pray we hit something like an Emrakul the Aeon's Torn. But this is not the case. And you know why? It's because one of my Creative Techniques again hits another Creative Technique. I don't know how I managed to flip so many Creative Techniques, especially when we have Emrakul the Aeon's Torn that almost wins the game. We have so many creatures in the deck, and the opponent makes a massive onboard punt. We get the Wanderer into play, which gives all of our creatures haste, but they don't kill the Wanderer before combat to give all of our creatures not haste anymore, as well as the game bugs. Here we get the Prodigy into play, which lets us copy a creature that entered the battlefield this turn. I'm obviously going to copy the Hornet Spider, whatever that green card in the middle, which lets me put 3 +1/+1 counters on every creature that entered the battlefield this turn. So I click all of my creatures, yet it only puts counters on 3 of them. I was really annoyed in the moment, until the opponent makes me feel a lot better because they cast Swords to Plowshares on our 9/6. I'm not really sure about this play because the Wanderer is on the stack. To make things even more questionable, the counters resolve, the Wanderer resolves, and all of my creatures have haste. Thinking my opponent has punted, I attack with everything. But then the opponent confuses me even more because after declaring attacks, they evoke a Solitude. This is one of those games where your deck just screws you over so hard that it doesn't matter what the opponent does because I'm out of Creative Techniques and I have no lands. So I ended up getting beaten down this game with no creative techniques. I just have a bunch of 6 mana crappy 3/3 flyers and 6/3 hastes, so I obviously lose. Going into boarding, we want the Ooze in and Pyrokinesis to interact with some of their creatures like Thalia to make sure we can prevent them from taxing our spells. I also don't like creative technique too much here because don't forget they're going to be taxing us. I think the Ooze will win us more games. I'm going to jump straight into turn 4 of the second game because the opponent just played a Richard Import and we're tapping lands until our turn 4 when we could cast creative technique. Now here we're obviously going to demonstrate it, which the opponent gets a Flicker Wisp and flickers their land. Now our creative technique gets a boarding party which cascades into the Ooze, which is a really nice pickup here because we can put some pressure on the board. But I think my opponent doesn't know how Storm works because they Mindbreak trap all of the spells on the stack without letting the Storm trigger resolve. So this lets us put 3 Oozes on the table and also set up for another creative technique combo next turn. After putting an Emrakul the Aeon's Torn on the stack in Game 2, I think it's time to let Game 3 speak for itself. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you guys soon with another funky deck.